All right. A 19th century Puritan scholar, a fellow named William Greenhill, he characterized the book of Ezekiel as full of majesty, obscurity, and difficulty. So if you've read the book of Ezekiel, I think you can relate to that. Now, my hope for this class is that I can convey enough of its majesty, remove enough of its obscurity, and lessen enough of its difficulties to make it worth your while to have been here. Okay, if you can leave and say it was worthwhile, I learned things, okay. But, Ezekiel's tough. There's tough sledding here, and I'm just going to do the best I can in presenting to you what I think is going on. As I said, because the book is so long, I cannot go through and read the way we typically do, where you read a section and then, now I'm going to read some of it. I don't know. Sometimes I will just comment on blocks of text, so it may help you to read ahead, just so you'll know if I'm not going to be reading it in the class, that you'll then be familiar with what I'm talking about. I wanted to begin with the historical setting. Here it is. The historical setting of the book. And as I say, this is always important. A lot of times we think that when you're talking about the background and the setting that it's just kind of filler, but it's not. It's very important to understand the circumstance of a book for you to read it right, for you to track it correctly, what's going on. And so I want to spend some time this morning going through that with you and just filling out some things. And there we go. Okay, you recall, of course, that shortly after the death of King Solomon in 931 or 930 BC, you had the kingdom of Israel divided. And you had Israel to the north. I don't know how well this is showing up. You had Israel to the north, and you have Judah to the south. You have the kingdom of Israel, the capital is Samaria. The capital of the southern kingdom of Judah is Jerusalem. You see Moab down here in Edom, Syria, Phoenicia, and over here is Philistia. And if you follow around here, the Fertile Crescent, you're coming over here, Mesopotamia, and you'd have Assyria and Babylon over there, and I'll have another slide for that in a minute. But the kingdom divided after the death of Solomon, and you remember that story, how that happened? And then in 722 or 721, there's usually like a one-year disagreement on exactly when some of these dates happen. But 722/721, you had the Assyrians completed their conquest of the north. The Assyrians were the dukes of the region at that time. They were the dominant power. And in 722 or 721, they completed their conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel by conquering the city of Samaria. Okay, that's when Samaria fell to them, and then the northern kingdom of Israel was absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. They deported a lot of people, and they imported a lot of people into that region. And what wound up happening is you had mixed marriages, of course, going on, and you had a lot of syncretism in the religion. And these people, this is who becomes the Samaritans that we read about in the New Testament. And they were looked down on by the Jews as kind of half-breeds who had apostatized. Their religion had become, it had gotten messed up by the other things that people had imported into it. So that happens in 722. They get carted off. Other people come in here, but Judah goes on. And we have at the time, I don't know if this will show up, but not very well. But I'll point out some things. Yeah, it's kind of dark. But here you see this is 700, 600, 500 BC, and maybe you can see something when I point out some things and indicate some things. Well, after the fall of Samaria in the northern kingdom, here you can't really see it, but this is Samaria falls in 722. This is Israel, Judah. This is the Assyrians and the Babylonians up in this stripe up here, okay? So here's the fall of Samaria in 722, 721. And at that time, Hezekiah, shortly after that, Hezekiah, he's king down here in Judah. You see, this is when he rules. Hezekiah, he banned the worship of Canaanite and Assyrian gods. Now, you can see how that would make sense. The Assyrians are the dukes of the area. He wants to, he's kind of rebelling against them. He bans, and of course for religious reasons, but he bans the worship of Canaanite and Assyrian gods. And then around 711 BC, he forms an alliance with the Philistine city of Ashdod and with the kingdoms of Edom and Moab. I don't remember if you remember on the map, Edom and Moab are down east of Judah. And he rebels against the Assyrian king, and that revolt is unsuccessful. And then when the Assyrian king Sargon, really Sargon II, when he dies in 705 BC, see, here's his reign, well, that's a good time for revolts because you have a transition time and things are in turmoil. So Hezekiah then decides to revolt again against the Assyrian power. And he does this time by forming an alliance with the Egyptians, contrary to what Isaiah had told him. So he just ignores Isaiah. He goes and he forms an alliance with the Egyptians, and he opposes and revolts against the king of Samaria. Well, the new Assyrian king, so Sargon dies. Hezekiah then institutes another revolt by making an alliance with Egypt. But this new king, Sennacherib up here, he doesn't take to that kindly. And he invades Judah in 701 BC. And he conquers many of the fortified cities, and we have his account of that. But you remember, this is the situation where he attacks Jerusalem, but God will not allow him to enter into Jerusalem. He protects Jerusalem from that assault by annihilating his army with a plague, and you can read that in 2 Kings 19. But by the way, we have Sennacherib's account where he speaks of having Hezekiah shut up in the city. See it here, Sennacherib attacks Jerusalem in 701. We have his account of it. And he speaks of having Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. But interestingly, he never says he captured the city. Okay, and we know he didn't capture the city because God killed his army with a plague, and then he went back. But in any event, it was a devastating loss for Judah because they lost all these fortified cities. Many people were killed, and this kind of thing. Now, Hezekiah down here, which you can't see, but you're going to have to take this little light. This little light means Hezekiah, okay? Hezekiah is down here. He is succeeded. He dies, and then he's succeeded by Manasseh. Now, Manasseh, who despite an apparent late conversion that we read about in 2 Chronicles 33, he's labeled as the worst of the Judean kings. And if you look in 2 Kings 21, verses 1 through 18, 24, 3 and 4, you can see what a wicked king Manasseh was. So he was just terrible. And so he follows Hezekiah, and he reigned about 55 years. He reigned from 697 BC to 642 BC, and that's reflected here in this long bar. So from 697 to 642. Now, some people think that he reigned 10 years less than that, from 687. Okay, but most people think he reigned 55 years, and it was a terrible time. He reversed the reforms of Hezekiah. You remember Hezekiah had banned the worship of Canaanite gods and the Assyrian gods. He was a good king. And then here comes Manasseh, who is really wicked. I mean, he reverses the reforms of Hezekiah. Let me read to you a statement of Daniel Block. Daniel Block is an Old Testament scholar. He wrote a 2-volume commentary on the book of Ezekiel. And he says, "The kingdom of Judah never recovered from the spiritual degradation to which he had brought the nation," he meaning being Manasseh. "After 55 years," he uses 45 years, but I'm using the 55 years. "After 55 years of court-sponsored paganism, Judean apostasy was so deeply entrenched that the sweeping reforms of the good king Josiah, who reigned from 640 to 609, you remember Josiah, that his reforms, he said, could do no more than scratch the surface, but not for lack of trying." Manasseh had instituted court-sponsored paganism. He brought the nation into paganism. And so it was something from which the nation never recovered. Now, the ancient kingdom of Babylonia, see, the Assyrians are ruling here. They're the dukes. But the ancient kingdom of Babylonia begins a new rise to power with this king Nabopolassar. He comes to power in 626 or 625 BC. Okay, up here. Now, the Babylonians are on the rise. Now, here's what happens. The Babylonians in 612 BC, the Babylonians, see, they're centered down here, and you see the Assyrians are centered up here. Well, the Assyrians were the duke, but they'd always had conflict and all with the Babylonians, but they had been the powerhouse. But you have, with the rise of Nabopolassar in 626 BC, you have a new, Babylonia is being invigorated. And so in 612, the Babylonians, in conjunction with the Medes, they destroy the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. Now, this is in keeping with the prophecy of Nahum, who had prophesied around 650 BC that the Assyrian capital of Nineveh was going down. And it went down. And then about 2 years later, we have them come over here. The Babylonians come over here, and they destroy the city of Haran. Okay, and this, for all practical purposes, this was the end of the Assyrian Empire. Okay, it was what was left was the mop-up operations. But with the destruction, they've taken Nineveh in 612, and they take Haran in 610, and that's pretty much it. It's all over but the shouting, is how we would say it. But I want you to just note up here Carchemish, because this is going to be the site of another famous battle. But in 610, things are pretty much, the handwriting is on the wall. The only issue that remained after that was who was going to control Palestine and Syria. Would it be Egypt, or would it be the Babylonians? This was the issue. This is what was still up for grabs. Who was going to control that region? Okay, and that after it became clear that the Assyrians were through. Well, in 609, you remember Haran falls in 610. And in 609, what happens is Pharaoh Necho II is bringing the Egyptian army up here, and he is going to aid the Assyrians in their attempt to retake Haran. Now, he wants to do that because the Egyptians fear the Babylonians. And so they'd rather have the Assyrians stronger to negate the Babylonian power. You see how politics is? Sometimes when we think about people in the old days, we think, well, they were just really dense, slow-witted people. They're just like us. Just as smart as we are. They don't have the technology that we have, but politics is politics. Power is power. War is war. And so here we have Necho's coming up here. Now, you remember in 609, he's on his way up here, and Josiah, remember Josiah reigned from 640. He comes in, you have Manasseh, then you have a brief stint with Ammon, and then Josiah comes in from 640 to 609, the king of Judah, the righteous king who instituted reforms, but what Bloch says they could only scratch the surface after 55 years of institutionalized paganism by Manasseh. But he comes over here and he intercepts Necho. He confronts the Egyptians on their way up to aid the Assyrians in their attempt to retake Haran. And Josiah is killed. Okay, Josiah is killed there, and then what happens is that Necho goes up and he campaigns for a few months up in northern Syria. But while he's up there campaigning in northern Syria, we have Jehoahaz is put on the throne. Okay, he's up there, and Jehoahaz, the people, Josiah is killed. He goes up and he tries to intercept Necho. Josiah is killed in that battle. And then while Pharaoh's up there campaigning in Syria, the people make Josiah's son Shallum, they make him king of Judah, and they give him the throne name Jehoahaz. Okay, so here he is down here, if I can read this. Here is Jehoahaz, but he's only going to reign a little while. He reigns just a few months. And then Necho, who'd been campaigning, remember, he's on his way up there. Josiah's killed trying to meet him. He campaigns in northern Syria for a few months. He comes back, and he gives Jehoahaz the boot. Okay, he puts one of his people, one of his puppets on there. Jehoahaz, he gives him the boot, but he only rules 3 months. And then he comes in, and Necho returns, and he deports Jehoahaz to Egypt because he wants to put somebody that he wants on the throne. And he says, look, I'm bigger and stronger than you. Your king is dead, and so we're going to put my guy on there. So in 609, he replaces Jehoahaz with Eliakim, who's another one of Josiah's sons, and he gives him the throne name Jehoiakim. Okay, some of these names sound very similar, and sometimes you see when they're written in English, they take the Hebrew letter and they'll do it with a CH sometimes or with a K. But you have here, he puts Jehoiakim on the throne, so he's Necho's guy. Jehoiakim is there. And then in 605 BC, I hope this isn't too much detail for you, but I like this kind of stuff. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, see, he starts his rise to power. Nebuchadnezzar, he's still the crown prince then. He's not yet the king. He's the crown prince. But then, see, when I mentioned Carchemish in 605, this is one of the great battles in history, Nebuchadnezzar defeats the Egyptians in the Battle of Carchemish. Okay, now that then sealed the fate. Remember I said the issue was going to be who controls Palestine and Syria. It was already clear the Babylonians were going to be, they had dealt with the Assyrians were finished. The question was whether Egypt or the Babylonians would control Palestine and Syria. Well, after the Battle of Carchemish, where the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians, he soundly defeats the Egyptians at Carchemish. So after 605, it is now clear that who is going to rule Palestine and Syria is going to be the Babylonians. Okay? So we know from the opening verses of Daniel that Nebuchadnezzar in 605, at least from one way of reckoning the way that reigns begin, in 605, he sends some people down here and he takes some captives from Jerusalem. 605 BC, that's when Daniel goes under, he is taken captive into Babylon. And he has here, presumably he does that because you remember Jehoiakim, who had been put here, he'd been put there by the Egyptians. Well, the Babylonian didn't want the Egyptian guy on there. So he comes down to Jerusalem, he deports some people, including Daniel, he deports them to Babylon. And some years later, he puts his guy on here. So we have Jehoiakim is put on the throne, and then Daniel is deported. And then some years later, Jehoiakim rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so Jehoiakim is still here. He's ruling. And he then, some years later, he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. And this brings us to 598, 597. So the first deportation is in 605, Daniel and them. This is kind of a minor thing, but he comes in here, he asserts his control over it, deports Daniel and some other people and takes some of the things. And then in 5, you have Jehoiakim rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, which was not a good thing. In 598, 597, which creates a great invasion. Now, in this invasion, in 598, 597 BC, many people are taken off, okay? And we have Jehoiakim is put on the throne here. Jehoiakim, during this 598, 597 campaign, Jehoiakim dies, and his son Jehoiakim goes to the throne, okay? But he's only there 3 months. He promptly surrenders Jerusalem because you remember Jehoiakim has rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. 598, 597, here comes this assault. Jehoiakim dies. Jehoiakim ascends to the throne. He's there 3 months, and he promptly surrenders Jerusalem without a fight, basically, because he didn't want Jerusalem to be annihilated. So he then is taken off. The royal family, Jehoiakim, is taken into exile. Ezekiel is taken into exile at this time. 597, he too now, Daniel 605 in that group, fairly minor deportation. Now we have a lot of people in 598, 597 who are being deported to Babylon. Jehoiakim, who was the king, goes. The royal family goes. Ezekiel goes. Many of the elite go, and they're taken there. And then at that time, we have Jehoiakim is there, and it's interesting about Jehoiakim, because though the royal family, they go into deportation, they're taken, but we know a lot about Jehoiakim, or much more than some cases, because it seems he fared relatively well in Babylonian captivity. Jehoiakim is somebody, we've actually found the Babylonian Chronicles. Now, I like this kind of stuff. We have found the Babylonian records where Jehoiakim and his family, with their rations and what they were given from the royal storehouses as prisoners. So we have the Babylonian records of them giving the food to Jehoiakim and his family. And he was freed after 37 years of captivity when evil Merodach becomes after Nebuchadnezzar dies, evil Merodach becomes the ruler of Babylon. Jehoiakim is freed, and he then eats at the king's table, and you can see that in 2 Kings chapter 25, 27 through 30. Now, I say that because despite the exile, see, the prophets never lost hope in the truth of a Davidic kingdom. They never lost hope that the Davidic line would continue, and Jehoiakim is the key piece of that line. See, he was taken into exile, and he was treated fairly well. He was ultimately released, and this is the Jeconiah that you read about in Matthew chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, in the lineage of Jesus. See, Jehoiakim was taken and preserved. The Davidic line continues through him. Okay, so he's up there, but when Jehoiakim surrendered to the Babylonians, Jehoiakim's uncle, Josiah is another son of Josiah, Mattaniah, he's installed as a puppet king in Jerusalem, and he's given the throne name Zedekiah down here. But he doesn't get much respect. He's always considered just kind of the Babylonian puppet and all that, because you'll see like Ezekiel dates his book from Jehoiakim's exile. But Zedekiah comes in, in 597, after Jehoiakim is taken out, the puppet king is put in, and then the puppet king, like they often do after 10 years, he thinks he's going to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, this is a huge mistake because this brings on the complete destruction of Jerusalem. The temple is destroyed, the city is burned, everybody else is carted away. And so that's where you are in 587, 586, with this horrible destruction of the city. So other people then are carted off, and only the poorest and that kind of thing remain in the city. Okay, long way to go, but I hope that's helpful to you. This is what's going on. This is where, so we have Ezekiel, who's taken in 597 into captivity. Okay, he's taken into captivity, and it's going to be 10 more years before the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem. So he spends 10 years in captivity before that destruction. He spends many years thereafter it. But he will be prophesying some before. He begins his prophecies, we'll see in a second, in 593. Okay, he's taken in 597. Some 4 years later, he begins his prophecy. And then so he's prophesying for a good number of time before the fall of Jerusalem, the ultimate fall, the destruction of Jerusalem, where Judaism is basically, vanquished. It's done away with. The temple's destroyed and all that. So he's there in that time. Now the prophet, I'll just leave this up, like say a little bit about him. Our only information about Ezekiel, it comes from the book of his prophecies, and it contains very little in the way of biographical information. But there are some hints here and some clues. He was the son of a priest named Buzi. Now you can see that in chapter 1, verse 3. There's some question about when it says the priest, does that apply to Ezekiel or does that apply to his father? You can't really be sure where to put that. So I think the better reading of it is, and when we get to it, I have a little footnote in the NIV. It says, or Buzi the priest. You can either say that it is Ezekiel the priest, son of Buzi, or Ezekiel, son of Buzi the priest. Now, I think he's the son of Buzi the priest, which means that he would have been trained for the priesthood. But when he was taken into captivity, he was at that time around 25 years old. And in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 30, it looks like that the induction age for priests was 30. So though he was well schooled and very familiar with the priesthood, and his father was a priest, and he had been trained for the priesthood, it seems more likely that he has not yet formally been inducted into the priesthood when he was taken into captivity. Okay, so I think he's the son of Buzi the priest, and but he's very familiar with I said Deuteronomy 4:30. It was Numbers 4:30. Numbers 4:30 indicates that the induction age for a priest is 30 years old. Now his name Ezekiel, it represents either an affirmation of faith, or it would be translated God strengthens or toughens. So it's either an affirmation of faith or it is an appeal of faith. May God strengthen or toughen. But if you're familiar with the book, you know that certainly is proper for Ezekiel, because he was strengthened and toughened against an awful lot of opposition and an awful lot of cynicism against his ministry. Because you can see people who are sitting here, and as we'll see, they're in captivity, and they're saying, listen, this is all fine. This is just a kind of a minor disciplining thing or something, and God's going to protect Jerusalem. We're all going to, and he's going to come and say, Jerusalem's going down. Now, people don't like to hear that. So you're quickly attacked if you're a voice of negativity. You're attacked as, you're weakening people and all this kind of stuff, and we'll see plenty of that. Well, in his 30th year, it says in chapter 1, verse 1, there's a lot of debate about what this means, but it most likely means that it was the age, his 30th year, it's how old he was at the time. So if that's correct, then it means that he was born in 623 BC. Well, I know there's a lot of numbers and stuff like that and dates, but I hope you can at least keep in your mind that he was there in a time of great tumult in Judah, because he grew up then in a life that was being threatened constantly by military subjugation by the Babylonians. His whole life was lived under that cloud. If that's right, he's born in 623. And he eventually, as I said, he's eventually exiled to Babylonia at about age 25, and it's there that he serves as a prophet. His ministry is conducted in captivity. He was settled in a Jewish colony near Nippur on the Kibar Canal, and I think that they've got this a little bit. This little thing says Ezekiel in Tel Aviv, or you could say Tel Aviv, depending how you transliterate it. But I think he's closer to Nippur. And it says on the Kibar Canal or river, and the river really is an irrigation ditch or canal that the people had dug to bring water into kind of a semicircle from the Euphrates to go around and to irrigate, and then it rejoins the Euphrates. So he's somewhere near Nippur, near this irrigation canal, in this community, this Jewish colony, we'd say, prisoners, people who are deportees, this Jewish colony of Tel Aviv. And so that's where he is, and that's where he's settled, and that's where he'll be prophesying. Now, he had a wife who died in Babylonia during the exile, which is a traumatic thing. But this is when you see what God calls him to. You remember his wife dies, and he's not allowed to mourn her, because that's part of the message that God is going to send. And so we'd sit here and say, that's crazy, you can't do that. You can't ask a person to do that. God asked him to do it. He said, as much as you love your wife and all that, I'm calling you, you don't mourn her because something more important is going on. I have a message to deliver through your actions to the people. Now, the date of the prophecies in here, the prophecies are dated. There are some you can figure out the date, and the range of prophecies, they range from 593 BC to 571 BC. Okay, he starts prophesying. He gets his call in 593 BC. So if you remember, so it's some 4 or 5 years after he's taken into captivity. When he's 30 years old, he gets this call, and so he's prophesying for a number of years before the fall, so from 593 to the fall in 586, 587, 86, the fall of Jerusalem, and then he goes on and prophesies for a number of years down to 571 BC. Now, he communicated his message, the message God wanted him to communicate to his contemporaries. I mean, he did it in a lot of different ways. And if you've read the book, familiar with the book, you understand what I'm talking about. He certainly has straight verbal prophesying, where he's just telling people what's going on. But he also has visions that he receives, and he recounts these visions, which are full of symbolism and things, where he's giving people the visions that he sees. He used parables and allegories in presenting the Word of God, and he took symbolic action, some of which is really wild. But he acts out things. He goes through these things, and all of these are different means by which God is delivering a message to the people there in exile, the people in Babylonia. The book it's very visual literature, okay, which means that it needs to be read differently than a letter. See, that's part of, when you're thinking about the genre, the type of biblical literature, you have to keep in mind what type it is. This is very visual, so you don't read it like you read a letter. Or you wouldn't, from our standpoint, you'd read certain things, a letter from somebody in a different way than you'd read a newspaper and a book and a novel. So it's the same thing. This is visual literature, and we need to keep that in mind because there's an awful lot of symbolism in it. Now, the book's arranged. There are 4 major sections. A lot of people say, put it in 3 major sections where they combine the last 2. But I've got it busted up into 4 major sections, and they are before the fall of Jerusalem, chapters 1 through 24. Now, within each section, it's almost strictly chronological, but you have 4 major sections. Chapters 1 through 24 are all before Jerusalem goes down, before 587, 586. So that's a large chunk of the book, and you can see it's going to be pessimistic. But you say, well, why did God write all this negative stuff? We need to hear it. They needed to hear it because they were having a false hope and thinking that God's not going to do this. God will do what he did for Hezekiah when he wouldn't let Sennacherib in. He will not allow Jerusalem to fall. He's going to let it fall. It is going to be destroyed, and you need to hear it. So he spends 24 chapters on that message, and then he has oracles against the foreign nations in chapters 25 through 32. I don't know how much time I'll spend on that, but he goes and, God is God of the world. And he has oracles against the surrounding nations and the foreign nations. And then there's hope and danger in the future that he speaks of in chapters 33 through 39. And then the vision of the new land, of the new temple and land in chapters 40 and 48, which I say many people combine with the 3rd section. So that's the layout. That's the thing. And looks like I'm not going to get terribly far, but there you have the introduction. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1, verse 1. I'm not going to do this with everything because I say it's just so long. I don't want to do it that way, but I'll just read here and we'll talk about this. It says, in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kibar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. Not Zedekiah, Jehoiakim. Okay, Zedekiah hadn't been sent out yet, but still, this is the key thing for him. He says, King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi. And then here's a footnote from the NIV. It says, or Ezekiel, son of Buzi, the priest. And that's what I mentioned a moment ago. He says, came to Ezekiel, Ezekiel, son of Buzi, the priest, by the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was upon him. So here we have Ezekiel. He's among these captives who lived in Tel Aviv. And you see that in chapter 3, verse 15, along this irrigation canal close to it. As I mentioned, it's this canal that brings water and circulates water around for farming and that kind of thing. And Tel can mean a ruined mound. You know, so archaeologists, they always talk about different tells that they're working on. Okay, well, Tel is a ruined mound, so it may be that the Jewish deportees were sent to a formerly destroyed city, and they were there to rebuild it. So I'm sure it wasn't a grand place. But here he is, he's at Tel Aviv, and you can only imagine how discouraging it was for Jews living there. I mean, they're laboring here in Babylonia, which would be a bust. I mean, they're basically prisoners of war, captives. They weren't there. They didn't choose to go there in vacation. They didn't choose to, move there. They have been deported there by a military power. So it's a bust in that regard. But here they are, laboring in this Babylonian wasteland, and the economy and the society, they were alien to them. Here you are, you're a Jew, and now you're over here in Babylonia. Well, that probably freaked me out. I mean, I don't do well with this culture shock stuff, other than my great French stuff, But, so they're over there, they're just out of step with everything. They don't really fit in. But probably most discouraging for them was that they were out of range for worshiping at the Jerusalem temple as the law required. You see, they're way over there in Babylonia, can't get back, aren't allowed to get back. And that's where the center of their religious cult is, just in terms of, worship. Not the way we use cult today in terms of, some crazy group. But the center of their religion was in Jerusalem. And so they were called to do certain things, and they're away from that. And the attitude of many is expressed, as you know, in Psalm 137. It says, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. And you can just picture how dejected the people would be who are exiles by a foreign power, and you're sitting here wondering, what is my God doing? But see, they're holding on, they're saying, he's doing something, and he's going to spare Jerusalem, and we're all going to come back, and we're going to party in Jerusalem. That's why Ezekiel's message is so difficult for them to take, because it's no, he's not. He's not going to do that. Now, in this setting of isolation, to these people who are seemingly cut off from the action, which is focused in Jerusalem. See, they see themselves as out of the picture. They've been taken away. The real story and the real happening is centered around Jerusalem. Well, to those people, God has a message. And that's what you see in his appearing here to Ezekiel. God has a message. He gives revelatory visions to Ezekiel. Ezekiel is to deliver a word to these captives. He has a message for them. They're neither out of God's sight or out of his mind. The fact that they have been deported and are sitting over here as captives doesn't mean they're not part of what's going on. God is interested in them, and he has a message, and he's going to speak to them. Now, this divine appearance of God to Ezekiel, this flies in the face of a widespread myth in antiquity that many people viewed gods as local. In other words, they thought that their authority was tied to the land over which they had jurisdiction. So Yahweh would be a powerful and influential God in Palestine. But he had really no influence and authority. Marduk would be the god in Babylonia. That's who you would care about. Well, see, this flies in the face of this, because here is God. He's appearing to Ezekiel. He's not limited to home turf. You see, he's not limited to home turf. Yahweh, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, he appears whenever and wherever he chooses. He is sovereign over all. And so here he is appearing to Ezekiel in captivity. And so this has a great deal of importance to it. Let me read it. I didn't put this in a slide because the reading is lengthy, but I want to begin in verse 4. Now get this. Okay, so here he has Ezekiel the priest. There the hand of the Lord was upon him. He says he's the 5th year of the exile. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. In verse 4, I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had the hands of a man. All four of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side, each had the face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward. Each had 2 wings, one touching the wing of another creature on either side, and 2 wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. Now, this raging storm. So here's this vision. This is one of the, we're going to have to go on a couple more paragraphs, but this is, I want you to try to picture this. This vision that Ezekiel has of the absolute awesomeness of God. These creatures are lugging his chariot. Okay, these are his chariot tenders. And listen to them. I mean, these things are like crazy in terms of power, glory. And they're just carrying the chariot. So what does that say about God? So you have this storm, this raging storm, and this great cloud that appears from the north. And that suggests the appearance of God. Okay, this is a theophany. God is on the move. He's coming. And that's what you see here. On occasion, God's abode is, I see it, first bell. On occasion, his abode is depicted as symbolically in the north. And storm clouds, they're often associated with divine appearances because of the power. You know, we still marvel at storms, how powerful they are. We'll see, so it makes a perfect symbol of the power of God. Now, these 4 living creatures that appear from within this glowing cloud, they fit the general description of cherubim. Okay, and in fact, we're told when they reappear in chapter 10, we can be certain, chapter 10, verses 1 through 22, that that's what we're dealing with. These creatures that he's describing, these are cherubim, and they're supernatural creatures that are often depicted as the creature that bear God's throne or his chariot. And here it's clear that what they're bearing is his chariot. Okay, they're carrying it, they're part of it, and as the following verses make clear, that's what they're doing. They're taking, they're not here as his throne, but they're bearers of his chariot. And you say, well, what's up with these cherubim? Well, the symbolism, see, to the ancient mind, to the ancient Israelite, we tend to, I don't know if we do this so much anymore, but we tend to associate the President of the United States with a black limousine. See, maybe now we'd associate it with the Air Force One or something. But certainly in the days of Kennedy, we associate the President of the United States with this black limousine. Okay, well, the way the ancient Israelites, they associated the presence of God with the cherubim. These things just went together. See, so that's what is involved here in this symbolism. These creatures certainly reflect the glory of their position, glowing and having the faces of the most impressive earthly creatures. Right? You've got the lion, strength and majesty. You've got the eagle with swiftness and mobility. You've got the bull with procreative power, and you've got the human with wisdom and reason. So here how they are shown with these faces of these impressive earthly creatures. But I think Douglas Stewart is right. That the key point, I think, is that in the vision is that they're oriented in all directions. I think that's what the key part of this is. They didn't need to turn to face the intended direction of their flight because they're already oriented in all directions. They are highly mobile in this regard. They simply move at the will of God. They don't need to turn and take that time or do any of that. They're facing in all directions and they're able to move responsive to the will of God. And so I think the vision at this point, there are 2 things. I mean, there's a lot of things about the glory of God, but two things that are, I think, key. Something that is supernatural and that involves God on the move is about to happen. Okay, so he's showing through this theophany, we see that something supernatural that involves God on the move is about to happen, and it is of importance to the exiles who saw themselves out of God's presence and therefore out of his program. So here Ezekiel, he's given this vision and he sees it, and so we see that, look, something's happening that involves God on the move, and you're going to be part of it, even though you think you're isolated and away from his program. Let me read the next 6 verses, say a word, and then the bell's going to ring. He says, as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not turn about as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. I mean, here we have the cherubim, see, they're stationed at 4 sides of the divine chariot. Each is able to see and move in all directions. And they're at the 4 sides of the chariot. And the wheels of the chariot, these are actually 4 pairs of wheels that intersect. So if you thought of a wheel this way on the ground and a wheel this way on the ground. Now we understand that those wheels couldn't roll both ways. Okay, because you'd have to be rolling through the other one. But this is a vision. And so you have the intersecting wheels, see, that are able to go anywhere. And that fits with the great mobility of God. The responsiveness, and you have these things, the wheels are so connected to this. It says the Spirit is in them. So there's no need to send directives. They simply, at the will of God, the thing moves responsively as the cherubim follow the will of God. Okay, we'll pick up there and carry on. Thanks.